I was born and raised as the second daughter of the Wilson family. But from an early age, I felt more like a minor character in a play starring my older sister Jessica, rather than a full-fledged member of the family. She was 5 years older than me, and according to our parents, she was impeccable in everything. Beautiful, intelligent, talented, admirable, and lovable. I learned this lesson early, and it was reinforced daily, in big and small events, in seemingly inconspicuous details, in the cold stares and unspoken expectations that hung in the air, filling the space between me and my family, reminding me that I would always be in Jessica's shadow. Before we continue, I am very curious. Which country are you from, dear listeners? Write in the comments where you are listening to us from. Enjoy listening. When I was 6, I felt the thrill of a real victory for the first time. After getting the highest score on the math test, I ran out of school with a sinking heart and hurried home, clutching a piece of paper with the cherished letter A tightly in my hands, hoping for praise, for pride in the eyes of Mom and Dad, for a moment of recognition that I missed so much. I flew into the house, found them in the kitchen, and beaming with happiness, handed over my work, expecting them to look at me with pride at my achievement. But Mom didn't even look at her, just smiled briefly, and without taking her eyes off Jessica, who was performing a new pirouette from her dance program, muttered, "That's sweet, honey, but look at your sister's pirouette." I stood there, holding my work, until the paper went limp in my hands, as if absorbing my frustration. Then she quietly went to her room, feeling something shrink inside, as small victories lose their significance when there is no one to share them. This pattern was repeated over and over again, invariably, inexorably, turning my life into a series of comparisons and underestimated expectations. Jessica bought new clothes at the mall. I got her everyday clothes when she got tired of them. When she was 12, she got her last iPhone because she needed it. And at the same age, I got her old flip phone and an instruction to be grateful. "Your sister goes to places like this," my father always repeated whenever I dared to complain. "She needs these things for her future." My future, apparently, did not require large investments. Our paternal grandparents, Margaret and Richard, lived in a fashionable neighborhood. Their house was surrounded by a well-tended garden, and a swimming pool shimmered with blue water in the backyard. They were also part of the same system as my parents, and every time we visited, the script was the same. Grandma Margaret greeted Jessica with enthusiastic squeals, tight hugs, lavished compliments, and then, turning to me, said in an absent voice, as if she had just remembered my existence, "Oh, Robin, you've grown up." But the one that stuck in my mind the most was Christmas, when I was 8. Jessica, with a twinkle in her eyes, unpacked the box, inside of which was a brand new laptop, given to her for schoolwork. I also got a pack of notebooks and some pencils. "We'll be practical," Grandpa Richard said with that condescending smile of his. "It's more your speed, isn't it?" But I had my own little world, my own private place where I felt important. The house of my mother's parents, Grandmother Eleanor and Grandfather George, was my refuge, my salvation, an island of warmth where I was not compared, ignored, or devalued. It was a modest ranch-style house, without a pool, without expensive interiors, without glamour. But it was full of comfort and love. A real magic happened there. I was listened to, heard, noticed. They hung my drawings on the fridge next to Jessica's work, remembered my favorite dishes, and cooked them especially for me. Jessica hated going there. "It's so boring there," she complained. "They don't even have a pool, and Grandma Eleanor never lets me choose what to watch on TV." At some point, she just stopped going there, and I was finally able to enjoy the company of my grandparents without her shadow, without her presence, without this eternal background against which my existence seemed dim. While my parents loaded Jessica up with her endless parade of activities, ballet, horseback riding, and violin lessons, which she dropped out after 3 weeks, I spent my days with my grandparents, learning how to bake cookies, sorting out homework, and having heart-to-heart conversations with them, feeling for the first time that I had something to say and someone to listen to. But I was 10 when my parents made the final verdict on my value to the family. It happened during what they called a family gathering, although it would be more accurate to call it a trial, where the charge, sentence, and punishment had already been decided long before it began. It was a Sunday afternoon in October, and the air in the living room was saturated with tense anticipation, as if before the start of a theatrical production in which each of us had already been assigned his own unchanging role. All 6 adults were in the room, arranging themselves like pieces on a chessboard. Mom and Dad were standing by the fireplace, bearing themselves with the importance of people who are about to make a fateful decision. Both pairs of grandparents occupied identical sofas, watching the scene with different expressions on their faces. Grandma Margaret and Grandpa Richard with cold indifference, and Grandma Eleanor and Grandpa George with intense attention. Jessica and I were sitting opposite each other on chairs brought from the dining room, and as she straightened her back and carefully adjusted her immaculately styled blonde hair, I already knew what was coming. Dad clasped his hands behind his back, giving himself the look of a businessman ready to announce the dismissal of an entire department, and after a significant pause, he spoke. As you know, higher education is becoming more expensive every year. Jessica nodded slightly, her face reflecting the seriousness and importance of the moment. At the age of 15, she was already practicing the pose of a future student at a prestigious college, while I folded my hands in my lap and just waited. We've been saving money since the girls were born, Mom chimed in, darting quick glances at Jessica but studiously avoiding my gaze. However, given the current economic situation, we can only afford to send one of them to college. The pause that followed was not a pause in the usual sense of the word. It was made deliberately, as in a TV show, when the presenter hesitates before naming the obvious winner. Jessica's going to college in 3 years, Dad continued, and his voice was full of solemn satisfaction, as if he'd just announced an indisputable fact. She has shown outstanding talent in many areas, so it is important that we support her potential. He turned to me, and his face reflected a mixture of disdain and fake sympathy, the same pity that does not imply real concern, but only emphasizes the insignificance of the person to whom it is addressed. Robin, honey, you're different. You're more suited for practical work. You don't really need college. Grandma Margaret nodded enthusiastically, as if she was waiting for the moment when she could get her word in. Jessica is so gifted, she exclaimed with delight, which I heard in her voice only when it was about my sister. Last week, her dance teacher said that she has a natural grace. She needs the best education. I sat there, feeling like I was getting smaller and more insignificant with every word. Not talented enough, not outstanding enough, not special enough to be worth investing in. The familiar message was now officially stamped and sealed, leaving no room for doubt. But then something unexpected happened. Grandpa George stood up so abruptly that his teacup almost tipped over on the floor. His face was red with anger, and there was a steel in his voice that I had never heard before. "This is absolutely unfair," he declared, and the air in the room trembled with an unusual sharpness. "How dare you write off a 10-year-old child?" "George," my father began, but Grandma Eleanor interrupted him, her voice as cold as an icy wind. "If you don't support both of your daughters equally," she said, looking directly at Dad, "then we'll pay for Robin's college ourselves." I watched them stand together like a united front, like a wall behind which I felt safe for the first time in my life. "Robin will have a chance to go to college," Grandma Eleanor announced, and there was such adamancy in her voice that even Mom lowered her eyes. "We'll take care of it." They turned around and left, leaving behind a heavy, stunned silence. Later that evening, when the house was already plunged into muted twilight and the night air brought with it the smells of fallen leaves, I was heading to the kitchen for a glass of water when I heard muffled voices coming from my parents' bedroom. The ventilation hole in the hallway, like a faithful informer, conveyed every word with frightening clarity. "This is ridiculous," Mom whispered, and there was irritation in her voice, bordering on contempt. Robin is not suitable for college. She barely makes it to regular classes. They should give us this money for Jessica's education. Instead, they will be wasted on Robin. She paused, as if weighing something, and then, lowering her voice to an almost conspiratorial whisper, she added, "She's just not smart enough." "I do not know why they insist on this," the father muttered, and in his voice sounded the fatigue of a man who finds it easier to agree than to argue. I stood in the dark hallway, my fingers gripping the cold wood of the door frame, and their words fell on me like a familiar rain, drop by drop, one after another. But for some reason, they didn't hurt as much as they should have. Maybe because I've heard it all before. Or maybe it was because Grandma Eleanor's furious promises were still echoing in my head, sounding like the first ray of light through impenetrable darkness. The years flew by like the pages of an old book, yellowed with age, their rustle filled with constant praise for Jessica, enthusiastic stories about her successes, admiring sighs of her mother when she talked to the neighbors about how her eldest daughter shines in her elite college, like a jewel, faceted by their endless care and financial resources. And my father's restrained but pleased nod when someone asked about her progress, while I finished school, trying to ignore their conversations, focusing on my studies, on the clock spent reading in the house of Grandma Eleanor and Grandpa George, where I wasn't compared, humiliated, or tried to convince that I wasn't good enough to deserve the same support as my sister, where I was accepted for who I was, without grades, without labels, without the eternal shadow of Jessica obscuring the whole world. But then the day came when their carefully constructed house of cards collapsed under a gust of reality wind, and the illusion of their perfect child crumbled to dust, leaving behind stunned silence and faded stares. I was sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by textbooks, poring over the lines of another essay, when the front door burst open with a bang, hitting the wall, and Jessica burst into the house, her long blonde hair tangled, mascara smeared on her cheeks, and her eyes, usually shining with smug confidence, were full of horror and tears. "Mom! Dad!" Her voice was trembling. It was broken, full of panic, as if she had just encountered something she was completely unprepared for, something that went beyond her usual world, where others always decided everything for her. I'm pregnant." There was a dead silence in the room, so thick that it seemed you could hear the porcelain cracking as her favorite coffee mug fell out of her mother's fingers, hitting the tiled floor, and the dark liquid spread in a puddle, leaving uneven spots on the white seams. Dad was the first to find the strength to speak, but his voice sounded muffled, as if through a layer of dense fog. "Who's the father?" Jessica sobbed without looking up, her shoulders shaking and her fingers clutched the strap of her expensive bag as if it could find the answer. "I don't know for sure." Mom's face, which a moment ago had expressed only shock, suddenly lost color, and she sank into a chair as if she had been knocked down, covering her mouth with her palm as if trying to stifle a scream or a desperate moan. I watched them as their world crumbled, but it took them less than 5 minutes to rebuild it, as if it was just a minor misunderstanding, a minor hitch in the perfect life of their golden child. "Oh, honey," Mom took off, wrapping Jessica in her arms. Her voice trembled, but there was no condemnation in it, only boundless pity and a desire to justify her daughter as soon as possible. "It's not your fault. These things happen." "We will help you raise the child," the father immediately added, his tone gaining confidence, as if he had already made a decision and nothing could shake him. "You stay here with us." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Are you serious?" My voice was full of amazement, indignation, anger that had been held back for too many years. "She hangs out, she skips classes, she gets pregnant without even knowing who the father is, and you still justify her?" "Robin!" Mom turned to me sharply, her eyes narrowed, and her voice became as sharp as a whip. But I couldn't stop. The bitterness that had been building up for too long came out. "No, listen!" I got to my feet, gripping the edge of the table with my fingers. "Years of disappointment, years of blind love, years when you didn't make her responsible for her actions. That's what it led to. You never let her face the consequences, never said no, never forced her to take responsibility. How dare you? His father's voice echoed through the kitchen like a thunderclap. Your sister is going through a difficult time, and you're being cruel. Jessica burst into tears again, burying herself in her mother's shoulder, and her mother only hugged her closer, as if protecting her from my words. Get out! Mom suddenly screamed at me. Her voice was full of hatred. Heartless little... I didn't wait for him to continue. I turned around, went up the stairs, grabbed my bag, and started throwing clothes into it, not sorting, not thinking, not realizing what I was doing, but knowing one thing. I won't stay in this house anymore. When I walked out the door, I could still hear them comforting Jessica, telling her that everything would be fine, that it wasn't her fault, that they would always be there for her. Grandma Eleanor and Grandpa George accepted me without questions, without reproaches, without hints that I had done wrong. They just opened the door for me, allowing me to enter the house that had always been the only real home for me. I finished my last year of school, living with them, focusing on my studies, on going to college, on what really mattered. And not once in all that time did my parents call, check on me, or even show up for my graduation. But I wasn't alone. I was standing in the center of the hall, wearing a robe and a square cap, and when I was presented with my diploma, my grandparents were beaming with pride. Their eyes sparkled with happiness, and I knew that at that moment, they loved me more than ever. In the fall, I went to college in another city. My grandparents paid for my tuition, as promised many years ago, and when I heard distant rumors that Jessica had given birth to a daughter and was now living with our parents, I wasn't even surprised. They probably still find excuses for her. Until they still treat her like an ideal child who can't do anything wrong. I was sitting in the very living room where I had once heard that I was not worth their attention, that my college dreams were nothing compared to the problems of their precious Jessica. And now they looked at me with despair, with hope, with the expectation that I would do for them what they couldn't do anything for their granddaughter, whom, as I now understood, they were trying to keep in this vortex of chaos created by their own hands, their endless concessions, their unwillingness to admit that Jessica was not the perfect child they had always claimed her to be. I felt like everything was boiling inside, but I kept quiet, let them talk, let them describe how they sacrificed themselves, paid off debts, hired babysitters when Jessica disappeared for a few days, how they turned a blind eye to her lies, to her promises to improve, which never came true, as they hoped that in the future, this time it's going to be different. But this time, it ended with her just getting up and walking away, leaving her daughter with no explanation, no goodbyes, no shadow of a doubt. She didn't even call. My mother's voice trembled, her fingers curled into a fist on the arm of the chair. And I saw something like pain in her eyes, although, could I believe her now? She didn't say a word. She just left. And you? I looked at my father, who lowered his head, avoiding my gaze. Have you tried to find her? He sighed, ran his hand through his gray hair, and it seemed to me that in recent years he had really lost a lot. Aged, lost the confidence that once made his voice so unshakable. She's not answering her phone, he finally said, and there was something almost helpless in his voice. And her bank account went to zero on the very first day after she disappeared. I closed my eyes, feeling the heaviness building in my chest, the thought throbbing between my temples, that I didn't want this, that it wasn't my problem, that it was their responsibility, their decision, their consequences. But then the image of a 9-year-old girl who is probably lying in her bed right now pops up in front of my eyes. The street was both a room in this old house, sheltered by other people's promises and hopes, not fully understanding why her mother abandoned her, why the people she considered her family now want to hand her over to someone she never knew. You didn't even let me recognize her, I said slowly, feeling the steel in my voice. 9 years old. You've been living with her for 9 years, taking care of her, and you haven't even bothered to tell me that I have a niece? We thought you wouldn't want to, Mom quickly interjected, her hands nervously clenching in the folds of her old knitted cardigan. You left us. You didn't want to have anything to do with us. I smiled bitterly. Because you've made it clear that you don't need me. There was silence in the room, filled only with the soft crackle of the old floor fan, which lazily blew warm air through the living room, dispelling the smell of faded memories. Robin, my father finally said, and I felt like he was trying his best to regain control of the situation. It's not about us. It's about Lucy. I took a deep breath, restraining myself from saying something that I would regret later, but I didn't have time to answer, because at that moment there was a slight creak, and I saw her. She stood in the doorway, a small figure with long blonde hair carelessly braided, wearing a faded t-shirt and jeans that were a little too big for her, and looked at me with huge gray eyes, so similar to my mother's, only there was no condemnation, no anger, no aloofness in her gaze, only curiosity and a slight wariness. "Are you my aunt?" Her voice was quiet but confident, not childish, but rather a statement of fact. I froze, feeling something tremble inside, as my heart shrinks from the realization that yes, this is my niece, my only remaining relative, who did not betray me, did not abandon me, did not pretend that I did not exist just because it was more convenient. "Yes," I replied, and my voice sounded firm, without hesitation. She nodded, as if weighing this simple word, calculating what it meant to her, and then looked at me directly, appraisingly, attentively. "Will you pick me up?" I felt my throat go dry. All eyes were on me, my father, my mother, tense, frozen in expectation, Lucy looking at me with hope, with a cautious trust that I have not yet earned, but which was given to me in advance. I never planned this. I never thought about becoming someone's guardian, someone's parent, someone's only reliable person. But at that moment, I realized that I was facing a choice, and if I didn't make it, if I left now, then this girl would grow up just like me. With the feeling that she was betrayed, that she was abandoned, that she was not needed by anyone. I looked at my parents, at their blank faces, at their fear of the future, which they were now shifting onto my shoulders, and suddenly realized that I no longer cared what they thought of me. It didn't matter if they recognized my rightness. It didn't matter if they finally realized what they had done. I got up from my chair, walked over to Lucy, got down on one knee in front of her so that our eyes were on the same level, and said, "Yes, I'll pick you up." When we drove up to my parents' house, I felt something painful, almost forgotten, shrink inside. Something that once made me freeze in fear of their condemnation, of their cold, demanding looks, of their eternal discontent. I took a quick glance at Lucy. She was sitting quietly in the car, but I noticed how her fingers were nervously plucking at the edge of her denim jacket, and I realized that she too felt the tension. The house looked exactly the same as the day I picked her up. Peeling paint on the windows, a fence that no one had fixed, and a front garden with lone weeds instead of flowers. But the main thing is the feeling of frozen time, as if these 5 years have passed for us, but not for them. When we reached the porch, the door opened almost immediately, as if we were waiting at the threshold. Mom was standing at the entrance, her face stretched into an unnatural smile that she had never learned to make sincere. "Here you are!" Her voice was too cheerful, too animated, and it was immediately clear to me that she was up to something. Lucy stepped back slightly, instinctively hiding behind my back, but I gently pushed her forward, making it clear that she was not alone. We entered the house. Everything here was painfully familiar. The same faded carpets, the same old armchairs with sagging armrests, the same faint smell of something musty mixed with his mother's heavy perfume. My father was sitting in his usual armchair, and he looked at us over the top of the newspaper, which he was obviously holding, just for show. "Lucy, you've grown up," he said, not moving, as if he expected her to come up to him. But Lucy didn't move. She stood next to me, her face impassive, but I could see her shoulders tense. "Why did you invite us?" I asked, getting straight to the point. Mom threw up her hands, feigning sincere surprise. Yes, we just wanted to see each other. After all, so many years have passed. We missed you. We really did. I crossed my arms over my chest, looking at her expectantly. Really? I couldn't keep the sarcasm out of my voice. 5 years without a single call, without a single message, and suddenly you decided it was time to see each other? Mom quickly exchanged a glance with Dad, who cleared his throat nervously before speaking. You see, Robin, we're not getting any younger. Our health is not the same anymore. Money, is not endless. And here it is. I knew it would be like this. Their sudden interest in Lucy had nothing to do with longing for their granddaughter, remorse, or a desire to establish a relationship. Everything, as always, came down to profit. You need money. I didn't ask. I just stated the obvious. Mom flushed and hurriedly waved her hands. No, that's not it. We just thought that maybe if Lucy wanted to stay with us for a while, we could, participate in her life, and you could help us a little bit. Lucy stood there in silence, but I felt her squeeze my hand. I'm not coming back, she suddenly said firmly, and her voice, which until recently had been childish, now sounded confident, adult-like. You weren't interested in me when I lived here. You didn't care what I read, how I study, or what I like. And now you've suddenly decided that you need me? Mom paled, clearly not expecting Lucy to say a word. Lucy, dear, we just... No, Lucy interrupted, and I felt a surge of pride inside me. She's not the same little girl who tried to be inconspicuous anymore. She knew what she wanted. I turned to my parents, feeling a strange lightness wash over me, along with the realization that I no longer owed them anything. We're leaving, I said, taking Lucy's hand. Robin, wait a minute, my father tried to interject, but I was already heading for the door, not wanting to hear excuses. When we went outside, the sun was already sinking below the horizon, painting the sky in soft orange and pink hues. I took a deep breath of air, as if throwing off the last shadows of the past. Lucy looked at me. Are you angry? I shook my head and smiled. No, I'm proud of you. She smiled back, and at that moment, I realized that all these years, we had not just become a family. We had become the support for each other that neither she nor I could find in this house. I started the car, taking one last look at the house, which was once a symbol of despair for me, but now it has become just a place from the past, and realized that we have only the future ahead of us. When I pressed the call button, there was a gasp in the receiver, and I realized that Jessica was going to play out her usual drama. She always started like this: a pause, muffled sobs, an attempt to evoke sympathy. Robin, her voice was weak, strained, broken, like an actress trying too hard. You have to understand me. It's hard for me because I'm her mother. I can't just leave it as it is. I took a deep breath, suppressing my irritation, and replied in the most even voice possible. You left everything as it is for 5 years. There was silence on the other end of the line, but not for long. I've changed, she said again, and I suddenly wondered how sincerely she believed that. Jessica has always been a master of self-deception. Her every failure, every mistake was always someone's fault, and she always convinced herself that she deserved a new chance. Prove it, I said, feeling tired of this whole conversation growing inside. Find a job, stabilize your life, show that you can be more than just a biological mother for Lucy, who appears when it's convenient for her. You don't understand, her voice trembled, this time not from theatrical emotions, but from suppressed irritation. You always put yourself above me. All my life. Do you think that being successful, having a career, makes you a better person? No, I replied, remaining calm even though anger was already boiling in my chest. What makes me better is that I don't leave the people who depend on me. There was silence again, but this time it was longer. I need money, Robin, she finally said, throwing off her mask. Just a little bit to get back on my feet. I've found some courses. I can work, but I need someone to help. I closed my eyes, pressing my fingers to my temples. It all came down to this again. She wanted money. Sure. No. You're my sister. "You're Lucy's mother," I retorted, "but that didn't stop you from leaving when she needed you the most." I heard a sharp sigh, something like a whispered curse, and the next moment, the connection was cut off. I dropped the phone on the table and covered my face with my hands. It didn't hurt me. It was just hard. This conversation was inevitable, and I knew it wouldn't be the last. Jessica wasn't used to rejection. Lucy appeared in the doorway, looking at me with slight concern. "Was that Mom?" I nodded, sitting up straighter and trying to find the right words. "She wants money." Lucy stared at me for a few seconds, and then, to my surprise, she nodded, as if that was exactly what she expected. "She always wants something," she said softly, coming closer, "but he never gives you anything in return." I hugged her, hugging her to me, feeling warmth spreading in my chest. "It's okay, Lucy. We're with you, and that's the most important thing." She sighed, and after a pause whispered, "You're my real family, Robin." I closed my eyes, letting those words sink into my heart, knowing that they meant more to me than any recognition from my parents or my sister. Lucy stood straight, not taking her eyes off the judge, and there was not a drop of doubt in her voice, not a shadow of uncertainty. She spoke clearly, calmly, as if after these few months, after all these years of waiting and pain, for all her life, she had finally found a voice that no one else could drown out. "Lucy," Jessica began, but her voice sounded uncertain, almost pleading. And for the first time, perhaps, I saw in her eyes not only anger and manipulation, but also fear. The fear of losing power. The fear of realizing that all her trump cards had crumbled to dust. But Lucy wasn't listening to her anymore. "I don't want to live with her," she continued, and although her hands were shaking slightly, she stood firm, as if she had grown a whole head in the last few minutes. "I'm not her thing. I am not a commodity that can be sold or bought. I am a human being, and I want the court to recognize this." There was silence in the hall, so heavy and hollow that it seemed you could touch it. The judge, an elderly man with kind but penetrating eyes, just looked at Lucy for a while, as if weighing her every word, peering into her face, trying to figure out if she was being pushed into these words, if someone else's will was behind it. But the truth was obvious. "I heard you, Miss Bennett," the judge finally said, and his voice was soft but firm. "And I take this into account." Jessica jumped up from her seat. "But she's a child! Stop it!" she screamed, trying to play the desperate mother again, but her voice trembled treacherously. "She doesn't understand what's best for her." The judge gave her a long look and then turned back to me. "Miss Rivers," he said to me, "all the evidence you have presented, as well as the desire of Lucy herself, make it clear that her place is with you." I heard Lucy sigh with relief, but I didn't loosen my grip on her hand. "The court dismisses Miss Bennett's claim," the judge continued, "and reserves custody of Miss Rivers." These words echoed in the hall, and I felt the tension that had been holding me down for all these months ease and then crumble, leaving behind only fatigue. Jessica jumped to her feet, her face contorted in a grimace of rage, frustration, impotent anger. "It's not fair! Stop it!" she shouted, but the judge didn't even look in her direction. I turned to Lucy, and for the first time in a long time, there was more than relief on her face. It was filled with joy, real, pure, warm joy, the kind that happens when fear finally lets go, when the door to the past closes behind you and something new and bright opens up ahead. When we left the courthouse, the cool autumn wind touched my face, and I finally took a deep breath, as if for the first time in many years. "Is that all?" Lucy asked quietly, looking at me with disbelief, as if she was afraid that in the next moment everything would change, that they would try to take her away again. I smiled and squeezed her hand without releasing my fingers. "That's all," I replied. "We're free." Lucy nodded and suddenly, quite unexpectedly, hugged me so tightly that it took my breath away. "Thank you, Robin," she whispered, and I knew that at that moment we both became truly free. When the award ceremony ended and Lucy came down from the stage, holding her award in her hands, her face shone with pride and joy. That pure, genuine joy that I dreamed of seeing in her eyes all these years. I stood in the crowd, applauding so that my palms burned and my heart squeezed with happiness, knowing that this moment is not just a victory in a competition, not just a diploma that she will receive in a frame, but a symbol of something much more. Proof that she was able, that she got out of shadows of the past, out of fear, pain, and loneliness, and now stands on stage not as a lost child, but as a man who built his own destiny. When she came up to me, her cheeks were flushed with excitement, and her fingers were clutching the prize so tightly as if it could disappear at any second. "Are you proud of me?" "What is it?" she asked, and there was uncertainty in her voice, the same one that remained from old wounds. And I smiled, wrapping her in a tight hug. "Lucy, I've always been proud of you," I whispered into her hair, inhaling the familiar scent of shampoo mixed with something new, the scent of self-confidence. She smiled and finally allowed herself to believe it, allowed herself to accept that she was worthy of pride, worthy of love, worthy of a life full of possibilities. The next day, I found her in the living room, sitting on the couch with Grandma Eleanor, who was admiring the medal, while Grandpa George was having a lively discussion about how her success portends a great future. "If you keep this up," he said, raising his index finger, "then in a few years we'll see your name in real newspapers, and not just in student columns." Lucy laughed, but there was a twinkle in her eyes, the one that says that dreams no longer seem unattainable, that they are real, close, and quite feasible. "I'll think about it, Grandpa," she replied, rolling her eyes playfully, but I knew his words penetrated deeper than she let on. It took several more weeks before she, seemingly by accident, struck up a conversation over dinner. "Do you think if I applied for a summer internship at the city newspaper, would I have a chance?" I pretended to be thinking, although inside I was already elated with pride. "The chances?" I asked again. "Lucy, you just won the main student journalism competition in the state. Even the teachers read your articles, and Grandpa George preserves them as a national treasure. Of course you have a chance." She smiled and nodded, and at that moment I realized that she had already made up her mind. The past no longer had any power over her. A few more months passed, and one morning changed everything. We were sitting at breakfast when I heard the familiar notification sound on her phone. She glanced at the screen briefly, and then her eyes widened. "It's from the paper," she muttered. I held my breath. "And what did they say?" She was silent, rereading the letter, then raised her head, and her face lit up with a wide, dazzling smile. "They're taking me on an internship!" I jumped up from my seat, wrapping her in a tight hug, and at that moment I knew that this path, this long, thorny path that we had walked together, had finally led us to where we were supposed to come. Lucy was no longer the scared girl who clung to me, afraid of being abandoned again. She became something more. She became herself. And as I stared into her eyes, shining with joy, I realized that I had finally become myself. Family is not just about those with whom we have blood ties. The family is the ones who choose us and whom we choose.